Welcome everyone to our latest critical conversation event, and happy World Engineering Day to you all. My name is Hayaatun Sillem and I'm the CEO at the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. Our overarching goal at the Royal Academy of Engineering is to harness the power of engineering to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. And we've been using these critical conversations to look at some of the engineering challenges and opportunities that are going to be crucial to addressing this goal. So, on World Engineering Day, I'm delighted to be chairing today's launch event for our next three-part mini-series of critical conversations on conquering complexity through systems approaches. Through this series, we're going to be exploring how systems thinking can help us tackle complex challenges more effectively. So many of today's biggest issues, whether that be climate change or urbanisation or cybersecurity or air quality, can't be solved with a quick fix, and they can't be solved in isolation, because addressing one part of the problem has ripple effects elsewhere. And that is where systems approaches come in, because systems approaches provide us with tools and methods that allow us to build a holistic and collaborative way of understanding challenges. They help us to see beyond isolated problems and recognise the interdependencies, the interactions and the unintended consequences that emerge when we look at an issue in a linear way. Whether that system is socio-technical or environmental or political, understanding that bigger picture is absolutely crucial for designing effective and sustainable interventions. And this is an area that's of great interest to us at the Academy, because engineers need to be systems thinkers. They are trained to visualise complexity, to design for interdependencies and to anticipate risks. And we've been finding that this mindset can be invaluable when navigating the challenges of an increasingly complex world. And while of course you would be expecting me to champion the role of engineering and engineers, not least on World Engineering Day, we of course also know that it's essential that engineers work in partnership with other professions and other communities in order to develop solutions that are inclusive, that are safe, that are sustainable, and most of all, that are effective. Over the past 5 years, through Engineering X, which is our joint programme with the Lloyd's Register Foundation, we have been working with partners across a range of communities, including policymakers, to ensure that systems thinking principles are embedded in real-world decision-making. And in today's discussion, we're going to introduce the fundamentals of systems thinking. We're going to examine how it can be translated from theory to action. And we'll be discussing real-world challenges and exploring the future of systems approaches in tackling them. And I'm delighted to be joined by three expert panellists for this session: Joss Colchester, Dame Judith Hackitt, and Dr. Stephen Wendel. Could I please ask each of you to give a very brief introduction to your area, starting with you, Joss?
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks very much for the invite. So I work with the SI Network. I actually founded it. We're a community and network of about 27,000 members spread around the world, and they're all interested in how do we learn these ideas from systems and complexity theory, and then how do we apply those to addressing those kind of complex, wicked challenges we hear a lot about these days. So we're an online platform. We support people from initial awareness, learning, connecting, co-creating with these ideas around these wicked challenges. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us, Joss. And I'm going to hand to you, Judith, please.
Thank you, Hayaatun, and hello, everyone. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. So systems thinking for me has been part of my training and my thinking since I first studied engineering at university many, many years ago. But through the work that I've done with the Academy, particularly on things like safer complex systems, which is part of the Engineering X program, and also work that I've done on policy making with government, I found the power of being able to apply systems thinking to not just engineering problems, but to social, economic, and huge policy and regulatory challenges that to deliver better solutions.
Thank you so much, Judith, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that later. I'm going to hand to Stephen for his intro as well, please.
What pleasure to be here. Steve, I'm an applied behavioral scientist. As such, my research focuses on how our context shapes our decisions and actions, and then the opportunities for beneficial behavior change. I'm the co-founder of Sistema Futura, where we develop qualitative and computational models of complex systems and use behavioral science to develop specific interventions to help people take action. Now, for many years in behavioral science, we developed small nudges to help change individual behavior, from recycling to washing hands, etc. And the results are notable for cost effectiveness. However, they're limited. Behavioral science has been less effective in addressing multi-level structural challenges, and that's where the field is going. And my passion is bringing the rigorous evidence-based study of behavioral change to complex problems like racism, climate adaptation, political division. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have all three of you bringing your expertise to guide us through this topic. I'm also really, really keen to hear from our audience on what you would like to know about. So please do pop your questions into the chat and we'll try and get through as many as possible. But I'm going to kick off first of all. So I think it'd be good to make sure we've got the foundations right. So I'm going to start with you, Joss. You've dedicated your career really to making systems thinking more accessible. So can you tell us how you define complex systems, and maybe also why you think that people sometimes struggle to grasp what it is we're talking about?
Sure. So a system is a set of parts that are interrelated or organized in a particular way to fulfill an overall function, and it exists in some kind of environment, and it has a boundary. I'm sure many people here are familiar with that idea. It actually, I believe it originates from engineering, right? Trying to understand the steam engine and, heat coming in and the work being done and so forth. More recently, we've derived this idea of a complex system from complexity theory. And well, a simple system is like a bicycle, right? It has those parts, they're interrelated to form an overall function. That bike, though, when I cycle it to work here in London, is part of a vast mobility system of London, and that's certainly a complex system. It consists of many different parts. Those parts are diverse and interrelated, and they're interdependent, and they're often adapting to each other also. And out of that, we get a lot of complexity, right? So we have all these different companies, we have all this technology and infrastructure and policy and finance and so on and so forth. And that thing's forming this vast complex system that is London's mobility system. And systems that are simpler, like the bicycle, behave very differently from the complex systems. So the bicycle is very intuitive to us. We put our foot on the pedal and it moves forwards proportional to the energy that we put into it. Complex systems don't necessarily have that kind of linear proportionality. They're often non-linear in many ways. We get these emergent phenomena. Small interventions here can have multiple effects across the system, and you can get this kind of disproportionality. And those are the kind of things that we struggle with to try and understand complex systems. This idea of linearity and the proportionality and 1 + 1 = 2 is very intuitive to us. In complex systems, it's often doesn't work like that. We put two things together and we get certain synergies, positive or negative, and the outcome, you can get an emergent outcome that's much more than the sum of the parts. Or we make a small intervention and that can through feedback loops result in hugely disproportionate outcomes. And that's quite difficult for us to kind of get our heads around.
Thank you, Joss. Well, we'll look at some specific examples in a minute, but Stephen, let's look at this from a behavioural science perspective first. How does complexity impact on our ability as humans to understand complex systems and to make decisions in that context?
Sure. One of the core insights of behavioral science is that our minds economize. We have limited mental capacity. It's a fact. And we can't think about and solve everything that we might want in our heads. And so our minds use shortcuts, simple ways to make decisions. And generally speaking, the more complex the problem we face, the more likely it is to use such shortcuts. So one example is the availability heuristic. When we default to a solution or to a concept that comes easily to mind, and this can be remarkably effective and efficient when the situation that we're facing resembles our past experience. However, when the problem has subtle differences or is entirely new, and our familiar go-to can lead us astray. In these cases, we can quickly and confidently use the wrong solution. And that's just one example. So there are many more, from how our minds form habits to how we process conflicting information. I think the general rule is the more complexity, the more our minds rely on these shortcuts. Think of it as we're not bad at complex systems, we're just bad at complex thinking. And when we face these multi-level interacting elements with time delay, nonlinearity, feedback loops that Joss mentioned, well, that requires a lot of complex thinking. And that's not our strong suit.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, we're going to look at some of the consequences of that shortly. But first of all, if I can turn to you, Judith, because we've already mentioned the engineering relationship with systems thinking. And of course, engineers have to grapple with complexity day in, day out. So can you talk to us about how an engineering mindset can help us address complexity, particularly in some of the sort of regulated contexts that you've had a lot of experience in?
Yes, indeed. I think for me, it's about providing a structured way of looking at complex systems, actually getting it down in visual form. To chemical engineers in particular, that often comes in the form of a flow diagram that shows how things move from one to the next and all of those interconnections. And when you've got it all on a screen or a piece of paper in front of you, you then have a model of the system that enables you to test it, find the weaknesses, think about what could go wrong without being fettered by some of those behavioural things that Stephen describes of simply shutting our minds to that's never going to happen. It actually forces us down a path of thinking about all of those nodes on the flow diagram, thinking about what could happen when two things come together, and thinking about how we can mitigate the consequences of that, and building more resilient systems, therefore, as a result of doing that, and doing all of that in advance rather than waiting for an accident or an incident or an unexpected consequence to occur and then trying to fix it after the fact.
Thank you, Judith. I think that point around visual representation is such an important hook, and I'm sure we'll talk further about that. I'm definitely keen to get on to audience questions, but I think it would be worth us spending a bit more time on translating the theory of systems approaches into how in practice they can work or not work. So maybe go back to you, Stephen, first of all, to share an example of where systems thinking has helped to drive more meaningful change compared to more linear intervention. I think it's useful to kind of bring to life some of the concepts we've been talking about with something from the real world. So, Stephen, are you able to give us an example?
Yeah, sure. Sadly, there are many. So in a recent project, we were working with Guatemala's healthcare system and how they treat survivors of domestic violence. In Guatemala, like many countries, domestic violence is pervasive, terrible. And one of the challenges in stopping it is that people don't report it. They remain silent. And so there aren't court cases, there aren't high-profile examples of people being punished, and there's a culture of impunity. And so an obvious solution might be encourage people to report abuse. And with that report, then there would be cases, and then some of them would win, etc. We can think about that very straightforward. And in behavioral science and in other areas, of course, we can come up with many different interventions that would help people feel comfortable reporting, talking about other people's successes, making it easy to do so, etc. But there's a problem with that. That linear analysis misses what's really going on. In particular, the reality is just much more complex and nonlinear, as I just mentioned. There's a feedback loop here, which is it balances out the reporting, it keeps it low, that's hidden in that system. And that is retaliation. So in Guatemala, and in some other countries, but particularly in Guatemala, there's an automatic report generated when someone goes in and talks about abuse in the health system. That report goes to the legal system. The legal system calls up the accused perpetrator and then does nothing else. And so you've created a situation in which you just angered the perpetrator. The person goes home, faces retaliation, sometimes faces femicide, and there's no protection. And so there's a very good reason that people don't report it. And in fact, the more that we would push, the more that we would ask people to report and report, we would see it go up in the short term. All of our numbers would say we're doing a great job, except after we left, well, then things would get worse and worse and worse because we didn't see this nonlinear, complex dynamics. One of many sad examples.
A really sobering example, Stephen. Thank you for sharing that. Judith, I think you've also been involved in another very sobering realm in terms of regulatory reform, particularly in the context of building safety. And it would be interesting to hear more about how systems approaches informed the recommendations that you made in the review you did following Grenfell. So perhaps you could just give us a bit of context and talk to us about how important the systems approach was and how you think it changed what emerged from that very distressing and very important process.
Thank you. So the review that I did almost 8 years ago now was of the regulatory system and how the regulatory system had allowed a tragedy like Grenfell to happen and to create a situation where, as we discovered in the early days after Grenfell, many other buildings were at risk of similar consequences because they had not been properly built for a whole variety of reasons. What I encountered was a system that people knew was broken, and I think this is something we should reflect on, that people often know a system's broken because it's not delivering the right outcomes, but they get really stuck on how to fix it because they either don't see it as their responsibility to do it, or they point to someone else and say they have to fix it because it's their bit that's wrong. What I was able to do, coming in objectively from the outside, was to do that mapping exercise, to look at how the system was supposed to work, and then ask people to tell me what actually happened in practice, and to point to the many nodes of failure, the many things that were wrong in the system that ranged from actually too many rules. And because of that, people were in this mindset of, I'm complying with the rules, so I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. They were not focused on, but are we delivering the right outcomes? So that kind of sense of, as long as I'm doing what the rules say, I'm okay, was enabling people to hide from the fact that the outcome, safe homes for people to live in and work and places for people to work in, was not being achieved. And they knew that, but they were hiding behind, but I'm doing what the rules say.
Thank you, Judith. Well, you flagged a couple of really important areas there in terms of how systems approaches work in practice, not least the need to remember that the outcome, the purpose of all this activity, and to start really from that. But the other point that you made in passing was the importance of talking to the people involved and to recognize that there are different stakeholders or personas that will have a bearing on how you visualize and then how you address your system. Just maybe you could build on from there and talk to us about some of the positive things that are happening in terms of organizations using systems approaches to drive change in the way that we would want it to.
Yeah, give quite a few, but just to pick up on that one, an example, I think an interesting one is UNDP's Accelerator Labs. So UNDP is the United Nations Development Programme, and historically they've taken quite a top-down approach where they have these programs. They kind of come in and have these multi-year programs that they kind of implement. And more recently, they started to see the limitations of that in the face of kind of complexity of the challenges they're dealing with. And about 5 years ago, they started quite a large scale kind of experimentation with these, what they call accelerator labs. I think there's about 100 or so around the world now. And these are little teams in these countries where they're working on development, obviously, development challenges. And instead of coming in with a plan and a program that they're going to kind of roll out for the next number of years, they're actually there to learn about the context, to learn about the solutions that are there, to learn about what people have to say about these challenges and so forth, and actually listen to that and take an experimental iterative approach that's really built out of that learning and trying to build upon what exists already and map out that ecosystem so you can actually try and find those synergies and actually find what exists there already instead of trying to impose something on top of it. So I think they're a really good example. They've been largely successful. I mean, the challenge then is then integrating it back into this larger system of the United Nations and the local governments and so forth. But I think they're a great little case study, kind of picking up on what Judith was talking about there.
Thank you, Joss. It's always good to hear a positive example. I don't know, Stephen, if you'd like to build on that, and maybe also talk about the challenge of balancing a systems approach which might feel like it's a rather sort of process orientated lens to view the world through, and the fact that we know that human behavior can be unpredictable, irrational, and introduces a lot of variability into how in practice you solve challenges. So interested in your thoughts on that, as well as some real world examples of where things have been effectively implemented using systems approaches.
Sure. I think it is unnatural. Our shortcuts help us in so many ways. I call them heuristics when they're good, and we call them biases when they're bad, but there still are shortcuts underneath. That system thinking approaches, we need a training, we need experience to make them feel more natural, more familiar. But most importantly, we need what Judith said. We need the tools that make the problem less complex and make it possible for us to engage with them. So, for example, you mentioned the challenges of human unpredictability. When we look at complex systems, if we're not looking at the inherent variability between people, and for that matter, the variability in ourselves over time and how we do unusual things and we're not consistent, then we're not really modeling the system. That human unpredictableness is a key part of any system. And so in terms of those tools that we use, we really encourage people to use tools that embrace that heterogeneity, that allow us to model that randomness explicitly. And so, for example, we use microsimulation, agent-based models, evidence-based agent-based models to model the probability distribution, how this unpredictable nature of human behavior can lead to a wide range of different outcomes. And we think about those together. And so, but there are many cases where doing so has led to good outcomes. We worked in a project in Kenya not too long ago. We looked at how the international development community, building on Joss's example of UNDP, had well-meaning, thoughtful programs, both trying to help this is pastoralists in arid lands in northern Kenya. And one of them was all about physical conservation and helping the environment so it wasn't degraded. And another one was about the livelihoods. And unfortunately, they basically were going exactly at odds. But with the complex system approach, by understanding the dynamics of the ecosystem, by understanding how these programs were effectively competing for the same resources, we could find policy and program solutions that made them work together and actually benefit the people they sought to.
Thanks, Stephen. We've got some questions from the audience coming in, so I'm going to jump to a couple of those and then go back to some of my burning questions, which I haven't yet had the chance to ask. So I'm going to start with Peter's question on where systems engineering specifically sits within that wider suite of systems approaches and what's specifically relevant about systems engineering. So I'll start with your thoughts, Judith, and then I'll probably come to Joss and Stephen and see if anyone wants to add. So Judith, would you like to start on that?
By all means. I've worked in a number of different fields of engineering in my career, and quite recently have been involved in HS2, the high-speed rail line that's being built in the UK. So been very close to real hardwired systems engineering and understand how that applies to complex engineered systems. And I think for me, that is the difference. Systems engineering really belongs in that engineered space where we are engineering true infrastructure systems. But the principles of that are so important that we need to extract them and apply them to other types of systems. And that's where the skill lies, I think, in being able to work with other disciplines. Learn from other disciplines, because we don't have all the answers. Let's be clear. We're wonderful as engineers, but we don't have all the answers. And we've got a lot to learn, particularly about things like human behavior, and how that varies and the unpredictability that brings into systems, which takes us into other dimensions. So I see the two things as being closely related. But they have different facets and different nuances.
Thank you, Judith. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Joss?
Well, yeah, kind of to reiterate, I mean, systems approaches are about how do we take these new ideas, this paradigm, this worldview of systems thinking, and apply that in many different areas. We know this has relevance, across the board, right? Of course, engineering is, as Judith said, it's about these infrastructure systems, it's about the technology, and I think systems engineering is a lot about socio-technical systems, isn't it? It's that recognition of the interface between the two. It's not just technology; it's about how that technology is used in society and how it interacts with many other things. And I think looking at it in that holistic way, all the way from policy to financing to all these different things that need to come into focus, I think that's what systems engineering is about. But it's a subset in the sense that it's not about, governance, it's not about the environment, it's about engineering in that sense. But looking at it I think in an open way, as Judith said, that it does interact with all these other systems, and we have to be considerate of those. And we are engineering complex systems. They're multidimensional. There's many factors in there. Yeah.
Thank you, Joss. I'm going to stay with you, and then I'm going to give Stephen a chance to come in on both these questions. So I'd like to add in Natalia's question on the role that you see AI playing in systems approaches, Joss. So welcome your thoughts on that, and then I'll hand the baton to Stephen.
Yeah, well, it's huge, isn't it? I mean, it's a technology, but it's also a social, cultural phenomenon. And an economic phenomenon. It's going to change work. It's going to change so many things. I mean, on the broader level, it's obviously going to change kind of what's needed from us as human beings. We're not going to, a lot of jobs, a lot of things that we do at the moment are not going to be needed, right? A lot of basic accounting, for example, it won't be needed. So I think a lot of kind of basic jobs that require basic analytical thinking are going to go. And I think in that sense, it may well be beneficial for systems thinking. It will require a lot more creative thinking. It will require this kind of synthetic thinking where we're looking outwards more broadly about what we can bring together and put together in synergistic ways to create new things, right? So I think in that sense, it can be an enabler and a supporter. On a more practical level, in terms of the technology, it can definitely help us better develop ecosystems, right? Collaborative ecosystems. If we have the right data, we can find the right actors to bring together in the right way. And I think it can automate and help us greatly in doing that, because that's a complex, very often quite manual process in terms of finding all those actors and so forth. And if we have the data, if we have those algorithms that can help us make sense of this and make those connections, it can really be beneficial in that way also. Yeah.
Thank you, Joss. I think some of us can't help feeling we'd love a bit more systems thinking applied to AI policy making, but let's park that. Stephen, what are your thoughts on the two questions we've just been discussing?
Sure. I thought that was a great answer. I'll build on the second one in particular. Think of it as the context, the interface, and the tools. The context is clearly shifting, right? In that, yes, jobs will change, and the systems we've already designed will be stressed because we weren't planning for these types of macroeconomic and job changes in our environments. So that's one. I think on the tools side, well, there are many ways that it helps us do things we couldn't before. So, for example, we all know the LLMs that generate text or generate images, etc. What's one particularly exciting application for engineers and software engineer before behavioral science is the data fusion, is the learning of patterns of data and the patterns of a population in order to bring together multiple sources of knowledge, which before was a very manual, very difficult process. And so data fusion through AI is a much less talked about tool that makes things possible. And the behavioral science side, we think particularly about that interface between the tools we develop, the interventions, the software, etc., and the people with which we live. And I don't know about you, but I really find that an interface that talks either either verbally or in text, it makes it more manageable. It makes it easier for us to relate. And we're seeing a proliferation of these agentic systems that you can agentic workflows that you can interact with in a human-like way, and then they go off and do some work for you. And so I think in each of these three areas, yes, we should expect a lot of change, and we should expect our existing designs to break down.
Thank you, Stephen. Very interesting. I'm going to move on to the next set of questions. So great questions. Thank you so much, audience. Keep them coming. We've got, I would say, two linked questions from Johnny and Cesar. So Johnny's asking about the complex systems toolkit that the Engineering Professors Council is working on. And this has got a link to the work that Judith, you've been leading as well. And it's seeking to help academics to embed complex systems and systems thinking into the education of the next generation of engineers. And so Johnny's asking what we would like to see in the toolkit, and Cesar is asking how we can integrate systems thinking into key learning objectives during undergraduate studies and also for practicing engineers in terms of the core competencies that engineers need to demonstrate. So Judith, I think I'll start with you on that and maybe then give Stephen the chance to jump in as well.
Thank you. I think there's a really important point behind both of those questions, which is how well do we and how consistently do we teach systems thinking to all engineers? And I think it varies quite a lot. It varies between engineering disciplines. And there is a lot that we can do and should do to bring together good practice and share it among ourselves. And that, I think, is one of the areas where we believe the toolkit is particularly valuable in distilling that good practice and showing how things that people might traditionally associate with one particular discipline are applicable elsewhere between different engineering disciplines. So really important work we can do there. And one of the things I'd really like to see us doing more of in undergraduate courses on that basis is simulating what happens in real life by bringing multidisciplinary teams together to work on problems and solve them, rather than everything taking place within the department or that is the subject matter of your course. If we could get more multidisciplinary teams working together on solving problems through system solutions, that would be much more like real life.
Thank you, Judith. Really important points. And certainly from an academy perspective, I can say that we believe very strongly in trying to support interventions that help us to not need to go through individual learning cycles, but rather have a more impactful collective learning cycle. And I think that's a great example of that. Stephen, anything you'd like to add to this question?
I thought that was great. I would just build on that and say almost all systems we deal with are socio-technical. I would include some aspect of psychology and understanding the variability of human behavior.
Great, nice and concise, thank you. There's so many great questions coming in. I'm going to move on to the next one, but Joss, if you haven't had a chance to say something, feel free to tag it onto a different answer. I'm actually going to go right back to Daryl's question, which I think is a really important one that other people may be wondering, which is, if someone is new to systems thinking, where can you start your learning journey? So Joss, would you like to kick off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's great books out there. I mean, Dunn and Meadows is normally, thinking in systems, that's normally where people start. If you go to the internet, you'll find plenty of resources. You'll certainly find plenty of videos and courses that we produce. So there's quite a bit out there on systems thinking. I mean, it's definitely, it's 80 years now since we really started on this journey. So I think you'll find quite a bit of content out there on that side, just searching the internet. But yeah, those, Peter Senge, Donella Meadows, and so forth, are a great place to start.
Okay, what we'll do is we'll drop those into the chat on the event page, so that if you missed those, then you can go and follow up afterwards, and we'll also share the resources that between us we have developed and we think might be useful to you. So I'm sure other people will also pop theirs in the chat. I think that's a useful question for us to be able to answer. I'm going to go to Ian's question now on how we can share and communicate systems thinking across all the different sectors that might need to be interacting in order to make a systems approach meaningful for a particular topic. And Ian used this example of sectors like the financial sector, where there might be embedded language and norms and nomenclature that is inherently sort of linear and process-based. And so how do we communicate across those boundaries? I might start with you, Stephen, and then hand to Judith on this one.
Yeah. Suppose I wouldn't, actually. I would instead ask, what problem do you face and how can we help you? Right? So, because no one should care about systems thinking, about simulation modeling, etc., unless it does something for them, unless it helps them with their goals and their interests. And I find, well, conveniently, there are a lot of complex problems out there, and so these tools can help. But that's where I'd start. And I would say, okay, in your language, how do you talk about this problem? Okay, here's a tool might help. And I wouldn't try to teach them. I do the same thing with behavioral science. I figure almost nobody cares about behavioral science, and they shouldn't. How do we address their problem? And how can we work within their environment and show the feedback loops, the nonlinearity, the emergence that's occurring in their experience and how they've been frustrated by it? I think that's a great place to start.
Brilliant. Judith, you must have faced this too in the work that you did on building safety. Any further thoughts to add to Stephen's?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with Stephen's philosophy. It's better to start with what's your problem? What's the problem that you're really stuck with? And let's see if looking at it in a different way might be able to help. That's exactly the philosophy that lies behind the work we do in the academy on where we mentor people, policymakers, and offer our support and advice and different ways of looking at problems that they are wrestling with, real problems, not in the engineering space, but ones where applying that systems thinking gives them the opportunity to look at something from a different perspective. I've had the privilege of being involved in that program for several years now, and I've been involved in thinking about how to apply systems thinking to things as diverse as how do you persuade people to be responsible citizens in regard to climate change, and also things like how do you prevent young people becoming involved in county lines drug dealing. And I can promise you that we are able to bring new thinking and new ideas into those spaces that really start to move things forward.
Thank you, Judith. Yeah, I mean, I also think you've exemplified one of the qualities we need to bring to the table when we are trying to genuinely embrace systems approaches, which is humility, because there is so much mutual learning in every direction that can be achieved, including from people who have no label as an expert, but who have really deep domain understanding of why is this not working in practice. So I think that's a really great point for you to have drawn out. I'm going to stick with you, Judith, on the question from Richard, who's saying, well, doesn't systems engineering actually require you to have time to think, which is not viewed as efficient in economic terms? So where's the business case for this, and how can we persuade more people to invest in it? And I'm sure Joss and Stephen might want to come in too, but I'll start with you, Judith.
The business case is about better outcomes. I think we can all point to examples of where people have moved quickly to what they think are solutions, which actually turn out to be not solutions at all because they deliver unintended consequences. And we've touched on that already. I think taking the time to think through what will deliver the right outcome is time well spent, and really important. Having said that, do I recognize the problem? Yes, I do. I think one of the biggest pressures we're under as systems thinkers is the societal demand for quick fixes to everything. And sometimes thinking about what is the right thing to do takes time.
Well, I'm tempted to dwell on that point, but I actually think I should come in and give Joss a chance to respond, because I'm sure this is something that's crossed your path as well. Joss, your thoughts on this?
Sure. I think you're often trying to show people how, if you're taking a linear approach in a complex scenario, you're essentially creating your own problems, really, because it doesn't work. So you need to show people how, okay, if you're taking this approach, it's leading to this, and that's actually creating the problems for you. And also the sustainability thing, that's a problem. We touched upon it earlier. Stephen started out on that about, if you take a linear approach, it's typically unsustainable in a complex environment. It goes so far and then it kind of crashes down. So trying to show people how they're creating their own problems and it's unsustainable and so forth is really, really key to that. But it's difficult to argue that, systems approach is asking for a more holistic and ultimately more comprehensive approach to challenges. And it's difficult to argue that a more comprehensive approach isn't going to be better than a partial approach, which is really what you get with linear approaches, right? You focus on one part and you try to optimize that. Obviously, it exists in an environment, and ultimately, just improving that part is not really going to get you those outcomes, and it's not going to be as comprehensive as a more holistic approach. So that's a pretty strong case in and of itself, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joss. I'll give you a chance to come on this, Stephen, but also to, at the same time, tackle the question from, I think it's Thomas, about how can we communicate the need for systems approaches in grants where complexity is often seen as a risk rather than a necessity for driving real change? I suspect you may have come across this.
I think it helps us to understand the environment in which the people we're working with, what they face. They're embedded in a system of particular incentives, of particular players, stakeholders, etc. What's going on in their lives? And how can we unlock that opportunity for them? And so, honestly, I have a very pragmatic approach of pick your battles. Often it is the people who are frustrated. It is where where the quick solution hasn't worked that we have an opportunity. And so I'd say focus on those first. I don't try to convince, don't try to persuade. Just say, it's more just vetting and see, are you in a situation where this makes sense? Do you actually have the resources? Do you actually have the space to think? Rather than arguing for people to go argue with their boss and to go get more money, just, are you in the right place to do this? So I find that is, well, to use the prior term, more efficient than trying to argue your way about efficiency.
Thank you, Stephen. A very pragmatic response. I'm going to come back to you, Judith, on something that you said and experienced as well in the context of the work post-Grenfell, which is that sometimes a crisis forces people to tackle something and therefore they might be open to a systems approach.
Yes.
But actually systems change is exhausting and you have to be in it for the long haul if it's really going to be meaningful. So how do you get people to kind of make sure they have stamina on this and don't have a sort of crisis response and then turn away from it? And I guess within that, we probably want to talk about culture change, because if you want change to be long lasting, if you want longevity, then it has to involve a cultural shift as much as a set of, interventions in the moment.
Yeah, really, really challenging issue. And first of all, I think in all of that, you need consistency of message, and you need leaders, you need champions for the approach. If you don't have those who continue to say, this is what we said we'd do, this is what we're doing, this is the progress we're making, this is a journey. It is not a quick fix, an overnight solution. We are on a journey and we are learning as we go. You have to keep saying all of those things and pointing to the successes, because people will be all too ready to point out what isn't working. So you have to be just as ready to come back with, yes, but we're making this progress. We've done this. This is what's happening. It is going in the right direction. We are getting there. So you have to keep doing all of those things. And I think the other point for me is you have to keep looking at and never thinking you've got the complete picture. So on the work that I've done on building safety, particularly, I am constantly surprised by the ever-growing range of stakeholders that impact upon the system. And just when you think you've got all of the people corralled and you know who all of the actors are, someone else pops up that you think, oh, they have a big impact on this system. We now need to bring them into this thinking and get them to understand the impact that their behaviors and the pressures that they apply to this system are having way, way away from them, something that they may not even see as being relevant to them. But for example, if developers set a budget for a project at the outset that cannot deliver what they want for the money, cost cutting, corner cutting, taking safety measures out of the system as you build a project is inevitable from the outset.
Thank you, Judith. Very helpful. Joss, would you like to add anything to this question about how you get sustained long-term change, including cultural change?
Yeah, I think it's hugely challenging, actually. Because when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about it in an environmental context, but I actually see it in a social context in our organizations. There's so much churn in organizations, people coming and leaving jobs and projects starting and stopping and, strategy changing. And there's a lot of change out there in the world, isn't there? So that drives change in the organization. And exactly as you say, that makes it difficult to sustain things over time. What I would say is you have to find the people who actually care. That's the key to it, I would say. We all show up in our jobs, in our organizations, and we have metrics and so forth. And those are telling us to do certain things. But there's a huge difference between the person who actually cares about this situation and the person who doesn't, And with these people, they're going to do what the metrics tell them. And as soon as things change, they'll leave. The person who cares may actually stay. So, I think we're going to get to talk about collaboration as we go along. But, actually finding those people, building real relationships with them who actually care. And then those relationships can actually sustain beyond, the changes in the political or economic environment. So you can actually build sustainable collaborations that last into the future. But yeah, maybe we're getting to that. So
yeah, I would just keep going. If you want to say more on collaboration, just keep going, because we're spending a lot of time on audience questions.
Yeah, well, it is huge, right? Because we can only get so much. Our organizations are linear, aren't they? And they kind of deliver on projects and so forth. And that's not really how we address wicked challenges, right? It requires this kind of multi-actor, multi-stakeholder kind of ecosystems, really, to address these kinds of challenges. And it needs a much more networked approach. And it really does require collaboration in that sense. And going back to that, collaboration is a challenging thing indeed. And it really requires people showing up with the right intention to actually make something happen, to, add 1 + 1 and get 3 out of that, So you really have to find those right people, those people who actually care and really want to make something happen, or else it becomes quite transactional. And as soon as the winds change, it falls to pieces. And that's a lot about building networks, horizontal networks, personal networks, where you're investing in your relationships. And actually that thing of really investing in the relationships is critical. Before you even start doing stuff together, before you get to the transactional stuff, so that you have an infrastructure there of trust, of relationship and so forth, and that can sustain when the winds start changing.
Really important topic. We could spend longer on it. I just want to try and sneak in another 2 audience questions. I'm going to group them together. The question from Kim, essentially saying, bearing in mind all that we've been discussing around the complex world that we are having to navigate, shouldn't systems thinking and complexity be embedded in education, including from early years? And then AJ's question, that change often comes from a new generation, and how can we prevent institutions and systems that are led by people from older generations that therefore have that, the power balance. How do we ensure that younger generations can be involved in system change? So Joss, I'll just stick with you and then I'll go along to Stephen for comment on that as well.
There was a couple of things I picked up.
So it's really, embedding, do we see this starting to be recognised as a topic that should be embedded in our education system, including in earlier years, not just at the level of higher education? And also, what about the generational power dynamic or power imbalance, and how that might impact on systems change?
I think it has been recognized for some time, the need for systems thinking. I mean, looking at the World Economic Forum's kind of top skills needed, I think systems thinking's right up there, has been for a while. Whether it's actually being embedded in schools, I'm not sure. I think that, reductionism and the logic from the industrial age is actually very coherent and very strong. So it's not so easy to kind of change that logic, and the whole structure within it exists. So I think, yeah, there are bright spots for sure, but I think it definitely takes time. I think we're touching upon another thing here, I think, about, kind of how change happens, and we have the incumbents, and, we need to get to a new system, and often it doesn't come from the incumbents, right? We need to actually grow and develop something new. So, I mean, that is core to systems change approaches, the recognition that you're always working kind of in two systems. You do have the incumbent system, but at the same time, you need to grow something new, right? And that's often an entrepreneurial endeavor. It may not be the incumbent systems that are going to have that vision to create something new. You actually need to go outside the system and grow something new until it's developed and grown. Really incubate that, you know. System change is about growing something instead of like delivering another project, right? So I think that entrepreneurial journey and supporting all of that is really, really important. And navigating those two different things is the key challenge, right? The paradigm of the existing system that has its own logic and so forth, and this emerging new system, and how you can actually try and, you know, transfer resources and so forth to the new system to enable that transition is really core to the whole thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Joss. And I'm going to nip to you, Stephen. Interested in your thoughts on those questions.
I think we struggle with the shiny thing and the thing that we are closest to and that we love the most. And behavioral science has failed in this way many times. In our arrogance, we tell everyone that they need behavioral science and they need behavioral understanding, and they don't. There's deep traditions that know their field a whole lot better than we ever will. And so when I think about questions of, well, should it be embedded everywhere? How do we drive generational change? What does it mean to have a cultural shift? I say, maybe we can start by using our tools on ourselves. We've talked a lot about the qualitative systems thinking. I think here we need to ground it in data, ground it in a causal model, and say, okay, what do we actually mean by generational power shift? What do we actually mean by culture? And who are the stakeholders? What are their competing demands? What is it they want? Let's model what we want using our own tools. And I think we'll find what we do with the people we work with. Wow, it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And that there are thoughtful people pursuing their own ends to very meaningful purpose that have nothing to do with what we want. And so how do we align with their world? And for that, I think we need a more grounded, causal, and data-centric model of the people working with and our own embeddedness in it.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm going to ask Judith to move us on to the last question area that I wanted to cover, which is looking to the future. What, from your perspective, is the opportunity for us to embed systems approaches into real-world decision-making? What are you most excited or optimistic about?
Oh, I think there's every reason to be optimistic. If I can just come back on the education bit first, because I think we should, again, you know, doing what I was talking about earlier. For me, our primary school system very much causes people to think about whole systems, although we may not call it that. We don't teach subject by subject in primary schools. It's in secondary education where we start to break down and put in those linear barriers by forcing people into subject matter experts and specialization rather than building that problem solving capability, which is what this is really all about. But having said that, what do I think are the opportunities for the future? I think they're huge for us to collaborate, to recognize that by building multidisciplinary teams and using the technology, including AI that we have available to us, we can address even the biggest problems that we face in our world today, climate change and so on. We have the capability to do it, but systems thinking needs to be at the heart of it. And the more that we work together in teams that bring all of those skills together, that we recognize that human behavior is such an important part of that, there are some real opportunities out there. And this is a really, really exciting field for me that brings people together in a new way and raises our level of capability to tackle some really, really tough challenges.
Thank you, Judith. I'm going to give you, Joss, a chance to come in on this question, and then I'm going to give Stephen the last word on it. So, Joss, what are your thoughts on the big opportunities that lie ahead?
Yeah, so I think the general context the world becoming more complex, people recognizing that the challenges becoming more complex. So I think that kind of awareness is definitely rising, and the need for new approaches. The existing approaches are unsustainable in many ways, and they aren't getting us to where we want to go. I think that general awareness is around, and that definitely leads us towards new ways of thinking, such as systems thinking, that many, when they see it, they start to recognize the relevance and how fitted it is for the kind of context we find ourselves in. And I see that across many different areas. I mean, one of the big ones at SI is, designers, and they've gone from industrial designers and product designers to UX designers to service designers. And they're dealing with increasingly complex systems, right? It used to be just a chair that they were trying to design. And now it's not even a service that's very complex. It's actually one that's spanning across multiple organizations. And they're having to do things way beyond what designers did before, such as enabling collaboration across these different organizations to get this service working. And they really recognize the complexity of the systems they're trying to design and bring forwards. And they're kind of coming to us and wherever else to look for systems thinking to help them. And they're not the only ones, right? There's the whole sustainability movement. There's, the entrepreneurial ecosystem area of things. There's systems engineering. There's many areas that are really bumping up against complexity and really seeing the need for this, I think.
Thank you, Joss. Very inspiring. And Stephen, what would be your take on this?
Yeah, I share both Joss and Judith's hope in that we have intractable problems, and we have some thinking and computational modeling can help us address these. And for me, I look particularly to the tools, like the evolution of designers and how powerful a force they've been, as Josh mentioned. Fundamentally, we are limited beings, and our cognitive capacity isn't going to change. Our ability in our heads to handle complexity isn't going to change. But we can develop better tools. We can change the context in which we work with System Design Toolkit, great tool, with better modeling tools, with ways to make these concepts meaningful and take them out of the expert community and bring them into the lives of everyday people, so it isn't so big of a jump for them. So it's more natural and more fitting with the constraints that all of our minds face. That's where I see the most hope. I see AI as a key part of that, but also just good practice, as Josh mentioned, the development in the design community of better tools and training and facing new problems. That's where I see the greatest hope.
Well, what a positive note to end on. Thank you to all of our brilliant panelists for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. And thank you to everyone who posed such insightful questions that drove the discussion. From my perspective, I find it very inspiring to think about the fundamental motivation for adopting systems approaches, which is achieving better outcomes on things that really matter. And that we actually do have tools and techniques to help us build this multidimensional, more dynamic picture or model that brings a starting point for us to tackle complexity. It's rooted in rich engagement with stakeholders, a really broad universe of stakeholders. It's rooted in better data that's visualized and integrated more effectively using technology and other tools. But it's also rooted in people showing real leadership, real consistency, humility, empathy, patience, so that we can convert that good intent into the outcome that we're all seeking. And I'm slightly reminded of where I started my career, which was in biochemistry, where one of the things that I always was struck by is how beautiful complexity can be. So we sometimes think of complexity as a bad thing, but if we have the right tools and we have the right community around us, it doesn't need to be something that we see as a negative, and there can be real joy in learning to conquer complexity. So again, thank you all for joining us. Do stay tuned for future critical conversations on our LinkedIn page. We have the next event in this mini-series on the 27th of March, and there we'll be looking at how systems approaches can benefit capacity building. So we'll be looking at some case studies from the Global Engineering Capability Review that we've been recently conducting, and the Engineers for Africa report, which is published today on World Engineering Day. And there's a registration link that should pop up in the chat soon if it hasn't already. And if this conversation has sparked your interest or you've got comments or feedback about today's event, please do respond to the survey that should also have been posted in the chat and that will be sent to you following the event, because your feedback helps to make sure that we continue to improve the events that we offer. And you can also catch up on previous critical conversations via the link in the chat below. But for now, thank you again to our brilliant panelists, and thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of World Engineering Day. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.